Hey, Geekscapists, welcome to a brand new Geekscape podcast. I'm Jonathan London, your host. And I want to say, if this is your first Geekscape, as I always do, we talk movies, video games, comic books, TV shows. Especially this episode. This one's a Miss Marvel special. We're going to be talking all about that first season of Miss Marvel on Disney Plus. She's kind of a recent Marvel character in the comics. She goes back to 2012. 2013, somewhere in there. So she's really recent, and she's already got her own Disney Plus show. What are the differences? What are the similarities? And how is this going to lead into the rest of the MCU? You know how Ian Kerner and I do this. We get really detailed, so there's going to be some spoilers if you haven't finished the season. If you haven't finished the season, there's also other stuff that you can listen to on the Geekscape podcast. You can go back 2 episodes, and Ian and I break down Thor, Love and Thunder. Maybe you got a chance to see that in the last week. It's the new Thor movie. And that's got a lot of cool stuff in it. So maybe you want to listen to that Geekscape. And if you haven't caught up on any of the Marvel stuff and you just want to listen to some geek conversation, our good friend Kim Coates from Sons of Anarchy, he came by and talked to me. It's a 30-minute short episode. You're going to have a cool conversation. We talked about everything from Waterworld to Last Boy Scout to working with Tony and Ridley Scott, making horror movies, a little bit of politics, Canada, US, some hockey. We just really ran the gamut, and we did it entirely in 30 minutes because he's such a cool dude with a great energy, and I think y'all are going to love it. If you don't know Kim Coates, well, enjoy that episode. If you know him from Sons of Anarchy and his recent appearance on Mayans, you're going to love him even more because now he's all about the Geekscape. He started following me on social media after I was like, oh, I better watch my tweets. I better be cool on this. You ever do that? If somebody you like follows you on social media, you're like, oh, I better clean up my act. So yeah, Kim started following me and I was like, okay, Jonathan, don't tweet like an idiot anymore. And then within 24 hours, I was tweeting like an idiot again. Okay. As you can tell, I'm keeping my energy high. Comic-Con's next week. I'm going to need it. But just for the next hour, let's just do a little bit of Geekscape, shall we? All right. Welcome to the live Geekscape, talking all about Miss Marvel. If you're listening to this on the podcast, then we've already recorded this one. I've sweetened the audio a little bit. If you don't subscribe to the Geekscape podcast, you definitely should, especially because next week is Comic-Con. We're going to be doing daily recaps. We're going to keep those as short as possible, but we're going to be, the Geekscape team's there. Matt and I are going to be at the Geekscape booth 3919. And we're going to have Derek and Katie and some of the other Geekscape members kind of experiencing the con. And then afterwards, when we all wrap up, we grab some dinner. We talk about what everybody experienced and how Comic-Con's going. We just do daily recaps. Those are also going to include some interviews with some of the booth guests that we got. We got some fun people coming by the booth this year. I know that we got Casper Van Dien. He's coming by, our old friend Casper. He's not old. He's just got a cool project coming out through Crackle. So he's going to do a signing at the booth with some other people like Peter Shinkota, who I've actually never had on the show, but I've been friends with him for a while. You may know him if you're an MCU fan because he played Nobu on Marvel's Daredevil. So be watching the Geekscape channels for the Geekscape booth schedule because we have a lot of cool surprises coming and a lot of cool guests that y'all can come and meet at the Geekscape booth. But if you're not there, subscribe to the podcast on any feed because you're going to be getting those audio interviews and catch-ups, and there's going to be a lot of fun content, as it's been like this week with the Thor special, the Kim Coates episode, and then now the Miss Marvel. So we're going to get into it. We're not going to get into spoilers yet, but let's catch up with a couple of you Geekscapists. Jim Paganelli says, whoa, do you have a beard? Did I wake up in an alternate universe? Come on, you're a good geek. You would know that that would be the mirror universe, and I would be evil Jonathan. Is that right? I got that right? I'm just starting to watch some classic Trek because Heidi and I loved Strange New World, and it references classic Trek so much that I was like, oh, you haven't seen a lot of these. Let's go back and get them. So we've been watching those now, waiting for that season 2 of Strange New Worlds. We also got Justin Peniston, who's a fantastic creator in his own right, saying Miss Marvel was pretty great. Episode 5 was a wee bit off the rails. We will talk about that one. That's a pretty interesting episode. But I'm here for a brown girl superhero whose only motivation is having been raised well. Absolutely, 100%. That's Miss Marvel. So I think we're going to try and avoid spoilers until we get into the episode breakdowns. But let's just get into Miss Marvel, because she's been in the comics for over 10 years now, and who better to tell us about her than my good friend Ian Kerner. Ian, so let's talk some Miss Marvel, buddy.
1 second, I just wanted to be clear. So are you watching these original Star Trek shows for the first time, or is Heidi?
No, I used to watch them. Remember, I'm not much younger than you, but during
but thank you.
No, buddy. What I want to say is during my Thanksgivings, TBS or TNT, one of those channels during Thanksgiving would do both Planet of the Apes and Star Trek marathons, and it seemed like every time there was a new cable company, the Star Trek license would be like what they played. Like I remember early G4 and stuff like that was just like original programming, and then like 75% of their program was original Trek because you could get them. And so I would just watch marathons when I was home and avoiding my family on Thanksgiving. Either Planet of the Apes or Star Trek, sign me up. But I think this is the first time I've ever watched them in order. And that's kind of cool. You know. And for Heidi, she's seen sporadic stuff. Next Generation's really her Trek. But dude, Strange New Worlds just... Geekscape is... We're not going to talk about it too in depth here. We got to talk about Ms. Marvel, but...
Yeah, but it's really great, particularly if you're an original series fan, which, I mean, I grew up on that, you know, and I mean, long before there was anything else, I was a big fan. So, yeah, it's really great.
What a love letter. And the season finale, we weren't going to spoil it here, but that season finale just gets you. It's incredible. It's incredible. It's the best show on TV.
I teared up. I mean, again,
it's incredible.
I'm a huge Trekkie. So.
And Ian, this last little anecdote. I was at the comic book store last week, and I'm in line at the shop, and a dude was picking up, I think either a Voyager or some other Star Trek. It might have even been Picard, a statue, and he's talking to the shop owner Paul, and he says, "I must be the only person on the planet who can't stand Strange New Worlds." And I was like, yeah, you'd be the only.
There's a couple others.
Well, let's start talking about this one. This is Miss Marvel, based on the comic. Ian, it's a recent character. Let's save the spoiler on what we saw in the finale that leads to the rest of the MCU. But like, what can you tell us about the comic version of Kamala Khan? What are origins? I think there's some supporting cast added here. What's going on?
So Jonathan, usually, you know, we don't usually discuss things about what we're going to talk about in advance. And he did give me a note to avoid a certain spoiler. And I'm not going to give the spoiler early, but there's an aspect of what I'm going to talk about that may or may not give the spoiler.
Okay.
You know,
so Geekscape
certainly if you know what it is. But
yeah,
I'm not going to give the spoiler. I'm just going to give you some background stuff.
Okay.
So,
got it.
You know, 10 years ago in the comics, you know, there was a bit of a mandate because, you know, at that time, obviously now we're all celebrating that Disney has acquired 20th and, you know, things are on the verge of changing. But 20 years ago, there was a big thing about, you know, for the longest time, you know, when the MCU started, Marvel had basically licensed out their most in-demand characters, which were Spider-Man, which were the X-Men, Fantastic Four, and even Daredevil. You know, they were considered, you know, those were the big licenses, right? So Spider-Man was at Sony, and the other characters I mentioned were all at 20th. And, you know, the X-Men was by far, for decades, Marvel's most popular. You know, in the 60s and the 70s, you know, it was definitely Fantastic Four and, you know, the Avengers, you know, Captain America, Iron Man, Hulk, Spider-Man, you know, but the X-Men really blew up in the late 70s. And so much so that by the time you got to the late 80s, like the X-Men were everything. And even down to a point that in the Marvel comics for the longest time, even editorially, it was funky because the best thing about Marvel was how much the Marvel comics all interacted. But editorially, for a while, they were actually kind of separate, even though they might have overlapped a bit, you know? And there's certain character histories that overlapped. I mean, you know, for instance, the Beast was an original X-Man, but he was in the Avengers for a really long time, you know? So he had these deep ties there. And eventually he ended up back with the X-Men, but for actually a lot longer than he was with the X-Men, there was a period when he was with the Avengers. So there was a lot of this back and forth stuff, you know, that had gone on. Carol Danvers, is interesting. She was originally introduced in Captain Marvel. Okay, that character, a little review from the Captain Marvel movie, that character was posed as a Dr. Lawson. Okay, and came here, you know, we infiltrated NASA, and Carol Danvers was his liaison. And his real name was Mar-Vell. Okay, and he ended up being a superhero. You know, he had these abilities. He had these things called negabands that gave him some of his abilities. Okay, at a certain point, there was a thing with, you know, Yon-Rogg, who was one of his big villains, and tried to use the psychomagnetron against him, and it hit Carol, and that's how Carol got her powers. And Carol was originally Ms. Marvel. Okay, because there was Captain Marvel. Captain Marvel was Mar-Vell. Eventually, and I think around 1982 it was, the very first Marvel graphic novel, they killed Mar-Vell. It turned out that in a fight with Nitro years before, he had basically gotten exposed to a lot of radiation, and he had cancer, and he died. And for many years, basically to keep the license alive, you know, the copyright, Marvel had always been publishing, you know, a Captain Marvel title. So that's when they originally brought in Monica Rambeau in Amazing Spider-Man Annual number 16. They named her Captain Marvel originally.
Why was there a licensing issue?
Well, there's always a licensing issue, generally speaking. Okay, because just to keep, you know, so
things
someone else
fall
can't
into the
take
public
it.
domain, right?
Captain Marvel was a very interesting one because a character existed that's called Captain Marvel for many years, published by Fawcett Comics. Fawcett Comics was eventually bought by DC. That character, most people always think of as Shazam, because Shazam was what he called out, was actually the name of the wizard that he got his abilities from. But he was actually Captain Marvel, and it was the Marvel family. And there was Captain Marvel Jr., and then there was Mary Marvel. But because it was a weird thing because even there was a TV show even in the early 70s, and they called that Shazam. So, and there was this whole back and forth. So basically what ended up happening, there was a lawsuit. And so Marvel had Captain Marvel, you know, and they were able to publish books called Captain Marvel. DC had this character named Captain Marvel, but they weren't able to publish books called Captain Marvel. So it would usually be the power of Shazam. When the New 52 came along, they said, well, with all this mess, let's just rename the character Shazam, you know, to get rid of that. But that was a very big sticking point for a very long time. Obviously, Marvel wanted Captain Marvel because it had Marvel in the name, you know, but it was based on Mar-Vell.
And I got to tell you, Ian, real quick, Facebook user says, the only podcast that does this deep a dive, and why you are always the first one I listen to for reviews. I really appreciate that. And then Previn Kaipo over at LinkedIn says, I love that I always get cool history lessons about comics with these videos. Thanks, guys. Really, it's Ian, which is why he's indispensable. I love this guy. Okay, so let's go ahead and start getting into the spoiler territory.
Keep going.
So
here's the thing. So you have Ms. Marvel. Carol's Ms. Marvel. You know, in the mid-70s, Marvel realized, oh, well, you know, there was some call for more female characters. So let's just take analogs of our characters. So, you know, you had Hulk, you got She-Hulk coming up soon, you know, and we'll discuss that next month.
And I've heard San Diego's already covered in She-Hulk stuff from a friend that was.
Oh, I'm sure. And I can't wait for it. You know, Spider-Man, you had Spider-Woman, you know. Oddly enough, Spider-Woman, very different than Spider-Man, but still, that was the point there. But Ms. Marvel came directly from Captain Marvel. So, and, you know, and they did some interesting things with Carol, you know. Originally, she was a NASA liaison, you know, and a pilot. Then they had her running a woman's magazine for a while, because that's a logical, you know, change and all that.
It was a different time.
Yes, but Ms. Marvel had her own series for a while. She was actually in the Avengers. And then, you know, her series got canceled. And interestingly, her series was written by Chris Claremont, who was the big writer of the X-Men. And he actually introduced Mystique in the Ms. Marvel book. Okay, and so you have her there. Then you have her in in Uncanny X-Men, and Ms. Marvel got canceled before he got to do the story in which Rogue steals her powers. So what happened is he was going to do it there. That got thrown off. They ended up writing her out of Avengers, and then they wrote her back in Avengers Annual number 10. And in that, she's found as an amnesiac, and that's Rogue's first appearance. And you basically get, the story of what would have been Ms. Marvel, I believe it was 23, as sort of a flashback that we'd never seen in a comic before. By the way, years later in a Marvel premiere, they actually printed, what that book originally would have been. But anyway, point is that so Ms. Marvel was very well known inside, the reality of Marvel 616 was a very well known character. So in the comics, you get introduced to Kamala Khan, and she's this giant Ms. Marvel fan. Okay.
And that's 2012. That's pretty recent. Yeah.
That's 2012, but Ms. Marvel had been around for a long time. And it was, I got to think about the exact year, but basically with Captain Marvel, after Monica Rambeau had been Captain Marvel, then Marvel had a son and a daughter. But, the son for a while, Janice became Captain Marvel for a while. Actually, they did a really good series. Well, the first series was Fabian Niciez's, which was good, but Peter David wrote it for a while and loved that series. Janice ended up getting killed. And so eventually, literally with a conversation between Captain America and Carol, in which Carol's like, oh, I want to honor his memory, and I never wanted to, do anything bad about it. And Steve basically says, don't you think it's time to honor his memory by being Captain Marvel? So she becomes Captain Marvel. So, the Captain Marvel movie, there's a lot of nods in there. They actually have, what's her name?
Annette Bening?
Annette Bening, yeah. Annette Bening actually is playing Marvel.
Mm-hmm.
She's Dr. Lawson and she's Marvel, but, so, and in that, Carol takes the name Captain Marvel as the nod and in remembrance of Marvel.
Well, I think we were talking about the X-Men, and you're talking about 12 years ago and where they were.
So 12 years ago.
So go ahead and spoil if you need to. Yeah.
Well, I don't need to, but I'll come back around to it. But I just want to say I was talking a bit about the interesting overlaps in Marvel. Carol, when she was amnesiac, actually ends up with the X-Men because Professor Xavier is trying to help her get her memory back
for a long time.
Yeah, she's with them for a while, and that leads to her, getting new powers as binary. And so eventually she gets her memory back, and eventually, so her power set actually got different, and she got even more powerful from binary, and then evolving that back into being, Captain Marvel. And the power set we now know her to have, like with the blast that came out of binary, is just the standard strength and flight was the initial Captain Ms. Marvel powers. Mm-hmm. But so you get interested in this character Kamala Khan, who's this giant Ms. Marvel fan. And the show does it something similar. She's a Captain Marvel fan. Okay, fine, close enough. Obviously, we didn't have Ms. Marvel in the MCU. So, but 12 years ago when they introduced the comic, basically there was a mandate. It was never really an official one, but it's basically this sort of understanding. Let's not make any more mutants because every time we make a new mutant, 20th has the license. We can't use the character.
Or they just profit off of new mutants that we make and put them in the X-Men movies. Yeah,
that's what I'm saying. So they're getting it. We're not. So the idea for Kamala Khan and that comic, she was originally going to be a mutant. But what they did at the time, they just said, well, listen, we have this other, Marvel has a few different groups of superpowered characters, so they pushed the Inhumans, hoping that they can make the Inhumans really popular. And what they did is, mutants just would pop up randomly. The Inhumans, also tied to the Kree, just like Captain Marvel was. The Kree had come and experimented on humanity a long time ago. And, first they experimented on them, then they used these Terrigen mists that would activate their powers, okay, or the genetic potential.
And we saw that in both the series and in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. They did those storylines with the Terrigen mists.
No, exactly. They did the Terrigen mists in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. I mean, they did the Inhumans in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. And then
but in the comics,
So in the comics, in order to say, because the Terrigen mists it was just like in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., it was like didn't affect everybody, and also Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. did this extra thing that if you weren't potentially inhuman, that it killed you, which wasn't the case in the comics. In the comics, they did this thing where Black Bolt had a reason that, the bottom line is that he did what they call the Terrigen bomb and dispersed Terrigen mist over the entire planet. So suddenly, all over the place, randomly, people were ending up in Cocoon. They'd come out, and now they had inhuman powers, which in essence is just like, oh, suddenly someone out of nowhere unexpectedly has powers. They've just come up with a new way to basically make mutants without them being mutants and something that they owned. So Kamala was one of those random people that suddenly gets hit with Terrigen mist and suddenly has powers, but the rest of her family didn't. So, that was an odd question. What did that mean? But, and it's basically, it's supposed to be it's a latent thing. It might be in you, it might affect you, it might not. So basically, Kamala is an inhuman in the comics. And for the most part, they haven't done much with it. They did do a little bit with it in an alternate, timeline, storyline that she was more aligned with them. But basically that's it. We get introduced to her, and I'll say this about the show. The show does a really good job of pretty much giving us, I thought, a really good, strong feeling of what the comic was. Going into this show, before it started, I had a lot of conversations, and people that listen to our other podcasts, even just the Thor one, I feel like we've been saying a lot lately that, at least I certainly have, that, it's interesting. Fandom's sort of divided in this weird way. But to me, it speaks to exactly what the comics have always been about. And that's Marvel makes comics for everybody. They don't just make comics for one group, and even the MCU, the movies, there's the giant fanboy, we want this big blow 'em up thing. But, the MCU movies in terms of viewers have gotten so big that clearly people watching these things, it's about more than just, hey, I just want to see people blow shit up, and I say that because it's always such an interesting thing when you talk about or you see, people being very loud about their opinions on the internet and all that. And where are the opinions coming from? What are they about? Because I know a lot of people that are saying a lot about how, like, oh, the show sucked. They're not for me. And the odd thing is, and I think you agree with me on this, the movies have been very disappointing lately, but the shows, for me, to me, it's without fail. The shows have actually been a pleasure. One nice surprise after another. Varying degrees, maybe there's an episode or two that are off a bit, I've seen the argument that, oh, these shows are overblown and, they're just, they should have just been movies. People that say that are missing the point of the shows. And in large measure, missing the point of actually what comics are very much about. And that brings me back to about the Ms. Marvel comic, which is, I said from the get-go, it's like when people say, oh, who wants that? It's like, well, that's just it. Who wants a Ms. Marvel comic? There are some people that do. Probably not the people saying who wants that. Yes, I was with a client of mine, who hadn't watched it yet, but it's gonna. I said to him, here's the thing, is Ms. Marvel the show meant for 50-year-old men? Probably not.
Let's hope not, actually.
Well, you say that's a joke. Listen, I still loved it, but what I loved about it is I loved that, it's a show about a teenage girl. So, and not being creepy, it's just like, but it actually ended up being a show. But I actually felt that the comic always did a really great job and got heralded a lot for the fact that, it's a Muslim girl in New Jersey, and with all of her family stuff and all that. And it really, from a representational standpoint, it's been really strongly heralded. The show actually, I felt, went even deeper into, the levels of things with the culture and all that, I just thought was fantastic. I have to say, like, my wife has hit a place with, in general with the Marvel stuff where it's like, okay, it all seems like the same. And once you get into the superhero stuff, it's like, it's whatever, boring, who cares? But the character stuff is what's interesting. And I have to say that, and that's actually what comics have historically and traditionally been. For all the great, you have the big fight with the villain, but you have this subplots of the character stuff and all that stuff. I was always joked around about it. Comic books, they're just the soap operas. It's the same stuff, and it's relationship stuff, and it's the pressures. And honestly, one of the best things, particularly about Marvel comics, always that, you saw these young people, you know, when you saw particularly like with Spider-Man, you know, about the pressures he was going through and having to worry about his family and what people thought and teenage things and all that, and worrying about money and all that stuff, you know, and that was a thing that, like, you know, the readers you could really identify with. You know,
Can I just
really
say that
appreciate that.
the pilot, the first episode of this, I came out of it saying this is my favorite Marvel Disney
You
Plus
did.
show because you have that. You have her trying to get her license and trying and failing her driving tests hilariously. And beyond that, just as far as a stylistic approach, I think that it had so much pop that it really reminded me of the recent Spider-Man films. It just had a great editing style, a visual style. Everything was kinetic. It had a cool pop comic book flavor.
Honestly,
to it.
I think it reminds me more of Into the Spider-Verse.
Yeah, you're right.
Anything.
And I came out of the first pilot just really enjoying it. Can we break down the pieces of it and see like that supporting cast that they introduced in the pilot? How much of that is from the page? How much of that is new to the comic?
It's all from the comics,
including Bruno and
Bruno,
her parents,
very
everything.
much so. Her parents, her friends. That's
fantastic.
It's all in the comics, you know. And
and now she gets these bands. She gets one band, a bangle.
So
and for the beginning of it, let's talk about what it is, because I think everybody was right. It was a nega band.
I mean, now you're jumping to the after credits of episode 6.
Yes. So Geekscape is. I gotta tell you that this stuff is spoiler from here on out.
Yeah.
Why are you watching this if you haven't finished the season?
So here's the thing: is I initially was a little bothered by the idea of them doing it, you know, giving her, you know, okay, a band is bringing it out, and what's it going to be? You know, I was really concerned about that because her powers are inherent, you know, in the comics.
At least as far as after the Terrigen miss hits her, yeah.
Yes, exactly. So, you know, so that was something I was concerned about. And, you know, it becomes, you know, great. It's the thing that they're all running after, you know, and so, I mean, great. It's a focal point, but, you know, you always worry about that because when that becomes the thing, it's like, it's going to lose that. Yeah. So, but, you know, it was actually, for me, as I mentioned earlier, the nega bands, it's a really smart thing to have an aspect of that. It was actually something that was a really, really major part of Captain Marvel for many, many years in the comics. Is probably the one aspect of Captain Marvel that was not touched upon in the Captain Marvel movie. So for me, the idea that they do anything with that going to the Marvels, I love that.
And when they go back in episode 3 and you see the origin of it, and it's on a Kree hand, like, you know, you see.
Well, that's the question: was it Kree or not? Now I feel
or is it a Jinn? Like, is it a Jinn?
This is the thing. So that was interesting.
I think it was a Kree, and the nega band came off of a Kree.
That seems more likely now,
right?
I was certainly wondering then. So here's the thing. So I mentioned before, you know, that there have been these different groups of superpowered, you know, beings, characters, all that. There's been a bunch in the Marvel universe.
Well, let's talk about that. But can you explain the nega bands from the comics real quick and how they relate to Captain Marvel? Basically, the transportation abilities of them, or do you want to wait for that?
I can get into that now. I mean, it's simply basically, you know, Marvel has the nega bands, and you know, in the comics, and one of my most disappointing things for me about the MCU is the lack of Rick Jones.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think
I was going to ask you if we needed Rick Jones. Yeah.
Well, that's just it. You know, they've done all these adaptations of the Hulk, the '70s show, these different movies, and we never get Rick Jones,
who's like a sidekick for a lot of the people.
Well, in the comics, basically, the Hulk story is, you know, he's developing a gamma bomb and about to do a test, and of course, recognizes this is the early '60s. So this origin is this kid on a dare drove his car out onto this thing, you know, and it's like sitting there playing the harmonica, you know?
Yeah.
And Banner sees it and he goes running out and he tells his assistant not to do the test, you know, hold it off. But if his assistant is a Russian spy and wants Banner to get killed, you know who the assistant is, right?
Go for it.
Emil Blonsky.
Oh, who we're going to see in She-Hulk.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah. So anyway,
I think Matt Kelly just announced a new Geekscape show coming to the network, so that's what that siren is.
That makes sense. So anyway, he goes out there and he throws the kid into, you know, a ditch, ditch, whatever. You know, and the kid's like, "Oh man, I don't need anything." He gets blasted, And the kid ends up being a sidekick and being the guy that's giving excuses for him and hiding and all that when he's turning into the Hulk and all this stuff. The kids, and that's Rick Jones.
Yeah.
Rick Jones goes on to, when Captain America gets thawed, because initially the Hulk's in the Avengers, and Rick's actually the reason the Avengers come together, because he has this team brigade where he's calling emergencies. So he's a big part of Avengers #1. And he reminds Cap of Bucky when Cap comes out of the ice. So Cap trains him to fight, and for a bit he's sort of like a new Bucky. And moving all the way on to, he ends up pairing up with Marvel, the original Captain Marvel. And there's a period where basically the Negabands, Marvel gets stuck in this situation where he's trapped in the negative zone half the time. Unless Rick hits the Negabands, he has his own Negabands. And so one of them's in the negative zone, and one of them is in the 616. Okay, and they switch places. Which, interestingly enough, I've always thought is more or less what Shazam is.
Yes.
Okay, so it's a sort of a semi-fuck you to Marvel. I always
use the
felt,
magic,
for instance,
and you can swap places.
And by the way, like Shazam, they never really deal with where the other body is. But Alan Moore with Miracle Man, or Marvel Man, to make that even more complicated, actually did deal with this idea that body still exists and is like in this limbo or whatever, and can actually come back eventually,
And Thor recently did it as well in the comics.
Well, yes,
I mean, but
Thor also did that with the Donald Blake thing and the back and forth. Absolutely.
And
yes, and they dealt with the different dimension thing. So, that's that's an interesting thing. But so basically, I wanted to mention about these other superpowered beings. Clandestine was actually a more obscure Marvel comic. They did a few miniseries, and there was actually an X-Men crossover miniseries. And Clandestine was, something that Alan Davis, who's a very celebrated artist,
I love him.
Actually wrote and created these characters who had superpowers, and because they were half jinn. Okay,
and Geekscape is you meet the Clandestine in the second episode of Miss Marvel,
right? So
because they want the band, they want this nega band,
and we come to find out that in this, Kamala is a descendant of the Clandestine. The grandmother exists in the comics, but we never get that deep a dive into the history of her family. And honestly, I thought that was what really set this show apart. It was interesting for me. I went into this going like, okay, well, right away, the light powers, the bangle. All right, these are some changes. I'm like, I like that they had the basic aspects of the comic with the family stuff and the friends, but I wasn't loving that. But I got to tell you, with episode 2, when they really ran with that stuff, I thought the show got really great. Well, the Clandestine are part of it, but just the history of the family, getting into the Pakistani, the partition and all that stuff. And, she did in the comics go to Pakistan and met Red Dagger there, but it wasn't about her family. It wasn't about that. And
how great are her parents? Her parents are like a reason to just continue the story by themselves. Like I could watch Yusuf and Monimba.
And they actually did do the storyline briefly in the comics where she didn't even tell her mother knew that she was Ms. Marvel.
She knew it was Ms. Marvel, yeah.
And unfortunately, they took it back and they don't know anymore. And I think that was a mistake.
They pulled a Peter Parker?
Yeah. And Matt Murdock, and they've done it with so many of them. But, but the Peter Parker thing, honestly, it really reminded me of exactly that time when Aunt May did know, and was cheerleading and all that. And I just feel, I'm so glad they did this early in the show because, both, you could argue in the real world, certainly in the modern real world. I mean, maybe it was different in the 60s. But, with all between video surveillance and everything you can capture and everything else, like, I'm sorry, there's just no way like you're going to recognize people. It becomes really iffy, even a secret identity at all, but certainly from people that know you. But honestly, that yeah,
like
absolutely.
The Department of Damage Control, because you have this character Pete Cleary who we already saw in No Way Home. He interviews Peter and his aunt and his friends about Peter being a part of. His identity gets revealed, and then we see him like a couple months later, right here in Miss Marvel, and he's investigating another teenager who has superpowers in the New York area. And are we building two champions? But would Spider-Man be a part of it?
That's a good question. So now we're going into some bigger Ms. Marvel things in the comics. So
And I'm
Kamala's
only
in the
bringing it
comics
up
world.
because we have damage control here. Yeah.
Yeah. So Kamala established herself as a hero. She actually, a bunch of the younger heroes are actually in the Avengers for a bit, and then decide that no, they need their own voice, and they form the Champions. Now, it's important to point out, and we've said this in some of the other podcasts, that there was a period where you actually had Young Avengers for a bit. And I've also brought up there was a comic called Dark Avengers. Now, the Dark Avengers didn't call themselves the Dark Avengers. They were just bad guys posing as the good guys. Okay? They, for the most part, acknowledge, what's that?
They were the Thunderbolts, weren't they?
No, that's a different thing.
Oh, okay.
So Thunderbolts was when the heroes were gone, were literally the Masters of Evil posing as good guys, as new good guys. Okay.
And they were acting good for the most part under the supervision of.
They were, but the Citizen V was actually Zemo, and he had his own agenda. And eventually, he was outed. He was out of the group. Hawkeye, who had been a villain briefly before he was sponsored, by Tony Stark for an Avenger, and became an Avenger, was good. He actually took over running the Thunderbolts for a while. But the Dark Avengers was at a time when Norman Osborn actually was running Hammer. S.H.I.E.L.D. was discontinued. They had Hammer. And so he created his own group of Avengers. Okay, so, and he was Iron Patriot, which was their version of Iron Man. But
and all that stuff going on. But how does that relate to the Champions and Miss Marvel?
Well, so just in the sense that, so what I think Marvel is doing is they're building up to a version of Dark Avengers, which they'll call the Thunderbolts, because they're not going to call them Dark Avengers, because no one would call them Dark Avengers, right? And they're building up to their version of Young Avengers, which they'll call Champions. So you're going to have characters, some of which were in Young Avengers, some of which were Champions, and it gets mixed around, okay? So, for instance, Stature, who is Cassie Lang, Scott Lang's daughter, was it was Young Avengers, but she'll be in the Champions.
And she'll probably be in a much bigger role of Ant-Man 3 for sure.
Oh, she's definitely going to be. Yeah. And she's going to be super powered in it.
Yes.
So, yeah. So, so we're seeing all these signs of all these characters popping up. So you could be sure that we're leading to Champions, But you brought up Spider-Man. So here's the thing. The Miles Morales Spider-Man was in the Champions. Because in the comics, Peter's older.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's an interesting idea. It's a tricky thing. The most recent Spider-Man cartoon, they actually decided to go ahead and make Miles, in it, but he's the same age as Peter, which for me, it's just, so you have two Spider-Men that are the same age. It's funky. Like, I like the idea of an older Peter and, and a younger Miles, because it actually feels a lot like what we got in No Way Home, with both Tobey and and Andrew Garfield being these older Spider-Mans, giving the Tom Holland Peter that
mentorship.
That mentorship. Exactly. That's exactly what you have in the comics with Peter and Miles. So it's Miles who ends up being very close with Kamala. We don't have a Nova yet, but so you have different Novas. You have the older Nova and the younger Nova, Richard Rider and Scott Alexander. There's even a version of the Hulk, who's Braun, who was Hulk for a minute, who's Amadeus Cho, whose mother was in Age of Ultron. Okay, so they've been seeding all these characters. We get, Patriot was actually, Isaiah Bradley. So we've already seen him in Falcon and Winter Soldier. So all these characters are popping up. I think, they're all coming. They're bringing it all together. So, that's definitely a place that I think Kamala is going to end up. I love that, we knew before the show even came out, she was already been announced. She's going to be in the Marvels. As I mentioned, and we've brought this up in both the WandaVision show, as well as talking about it with Captain Marvel, that you already have Monica Rambeau, and she got her powers in WandaVision. So that character in the comics eventually became known as Photon, but she used to be Captain Marvel. So, so they're all going to be in the Marvels.
So, Ian, there are people online who were a little bit ruffled by how much liberty they took with the clandestine. Like, was that a thing? Like, did they take that much of a deviation from the comics?
Yeah, they did. Well,
they seem to have different powers. They seem to be originated.
Straight now, we don't really see many powers, from them in this.
Right.
And honestly, all they really did is they said, "Hey, here's a name, and it's Jin based or partial Jin based, and that's
is the
it."
Noir dimension a thing in the comics?
Not in a way that matters.
I'll tell you why I like it here, and it goes with what started to throw me off with maybe the bangle not being a negaband until I saw it come off of a blue arm. At that point, I was like, "That's a negaband" because it just came off of a Kree arm, and I was ready to die on that hill. Nur is and I'm probably mispronouncing it.
Were you running up that hill?
No, Nur is a term in Islamic context referring to the cold light of the night or heatless light, and the light of the moon, and so you're starting to think about this like other dimension. And so I'm reading up on Wikipedia about this Islamic term and how they use the Nur dimension, and they're just kind of turning things a little bit closer to a cultural reference point. And so they're taking Marvel ideas and they're adding a little bit more of a cultural reference point to them in order to adapt them into the series. And I think that's cool. I think it's awesome to have a little. And at that point, I was like, maybe it's not a negaband because they're now not thinking about the negative zone. They're thinking about this Nur dimension. And okay, this is starting to get a little.
Well, by the way,
confusing.
why I'm hoping it's negative zone.
Of course, Fantastic Four, baby.
Right.
Which is the biggest thing about the negative zone is that's his Reed Richards' playground. But now you have this idea of a Noir dimension in the rift or the veil that they want to get through the veil. They want to pass through the veil and get back to the Noir dimension. And so we'll talk about episode 5, the time travel episode, how funky it is. But mainly I want to talk about the ending of it real quick, because they do succeed in getting the veil opened and pass into the Noir dimension. But at that point, it seems like they're starting to have Terrigen Mist mutations gone bad. It turns them to stone like it did in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., and then it powders them or turns them into skeletons. And at that point, I was like, oh,
well
that feels like Terrigen Mist stuff.
But Kamala had said, what they established earlier was that, no, what they're going to do is going to kill everybody. Right?
It's open the veil.
It's, for me, some of that was really a little bit unclear, like even down to, the motivations at the end of episode 5 there. Like, is she truly sacrificing herself to save her son? And why did that blast go out and give him abilities just because she was thinking of him? Like, and he doesn't need a bangle.
Come from the negative zone?
Well, I mean,
is that where they were trying to get to, and they needed the bangle to get to it?
Yes, that's what they're saying. They needed the bangle to open it up. But I mean, it was not as developed as it might have been. They kind of threw some.
That was my argument with the series. There was a lot of different ideas going around, and it felt like it needed just a little bit more refinement. As much as I enjoyed it.
Like for me, at the end there, I'm like, okay, so she had the bangle. The bangle opened up her abilities, but then Cameron just gets some kind of psychic blast while she's dying from his mother, and now his abilities are there, and he has the same one she does. I was like, why is that?
It's a spikier, dangerous version of it.
I don't think it was, because I think it's just whatever you think, however you think to use it. She could do spikes if she wanted. Is
episode 5 the transportation back to Pakistan, or really it was India at the time, but it was that part of the transportation abilities of the negaband to the bangle?
No, we've never seen time travel before,
right?
And we don't know. I mean, no traveling through the quantum zone this time. I mean, one of the things I do like that the shows have done, it was a big conversation we had back with Thor, and then starting with Doctor Strange, but they're leaning into different kinds of abilities and powers and sources, right? I mean, straight up in Moon Knight, we got, these other gods. Now with this, it's coming from something different, seemingly. I mean, the clandestines certainly aren't Kree. Doesn't mean that the bangle isn't Kree in some way, right? I mean, that's definitely possible. By the way, one of the aspects, something I've always found a little messy, but Marvel Boy is a character in the comics.
Yes.
Who also ends up in the Young Avengers for a while. And
is that the Grant Morrison version?
Yeah, he's a Kree from a different universe. And his Kree apparently actively travel the multiverse. Like, that's a thing. So it remains to be seen if they're going to do anything, like that with the, because maybe that was a Kree.
Cameron's not a character from the comic. I mean, none of these clandestine
No.
are characters from the comics. They're just were the clandestine. Okay.
Yeah.
We haven't seen Cameron or any of them in the comics.
No, the Cameron one is an interesting one because I thought it was really, they didn't leave him the way they did without definitive plans for him.
Wait, say what you said again, because now we're
they
getting
didn't leave that
6.
character at the end of the episode the way they did without knowing exactly what they're doing with him.
Yeah, he's met up.
It wasn't like okay, we created him and whatever, and and it could have just been another leader or whatever. But it was so much more than that. He's very specifically set him up in a very specific place, as though that's meant to be something.
Yeah, he's got powers, and he's with Kareem, who we met in Pakistan, the Red Daggers.
Red Dagger, yeah.
Who are the Red Daggers? Were they a big part of the Pakistan?
That wasn't a whole organization. And in the comics, we meet Red Dagger when Kamala goes to Pakistan, visits. Then he comes over to New Jersey.
Okay. So now we have the superpowered person running around with like an assassin group, an organization in Pakistan.
Maybe,
and where does that leave the 10 Rings? Because we have them still hanging out.
They're definitely going to come back in. So, that's interesting. We'll see. Listen, they've set up some interesting things that are out there, and coming back around to what I was saying before, see, this is why I like the shows so much, because they're giving room to develop these characters, and see what they're really about, who they are, listen, my big complaint with Ms. Marvel, because we've been talking about a lot of stuff, and I guess, I don't know if we've really given a review that much. I think both of us really enjoyed the show. I really enjoy the culture stuff and character stuff. I went into it going like, well, there isn't really a big bad specifically for her to fight. And there wasn't, I thought that the culmination of what it seemed like from episode 2, her big thing to overcome happened in episode 5. And episode 6,
the clandestine in the veil.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then episode 6 felt more like a little epilogue of that, right?
Well, Damage Control felt like they could have been the big bad alone, but it wouldn't have given us a whole lot about the Bengal and the Kree and the Negaband.
And you want that to be it, But I mean, listen,
right?
I thought, again, I thought that they made some really great political statements with that. The fact that episode 6 had a disclaimer on the opening of it, and my wife and I were like, oh, because based on that disclaimer, it was like, all right, isn't that in everything? Or maybe some people may find it disturbing. I said, yeah, well, probably the imagery of armed, even though they were government, but armed people with, assault rifles going into a high school.
Yeah,
maybe something a little bit uncomfortable about that. But I actually thought the fact that might make people uncomfortable played exactly right, because that's how you should have felt.
I read a couple of jokes that it was based on old school, let's say white Marvel fans being upset that there was an entire show given to a brown character, and that's why the warning label is like, you might have to see a show with a brown character, so be ready for that. I saw a couple of jokes about that.
And I think that's funny. Yeah, a brown character and a girl, no less.
I mean, how dare they make a show about that?
And it's frustrating, I mean, it's interesting though, because there's some of that, but I don't know why it's so bad in Star Wars.
Oh, in Star Wars, the doxing just comes out. You're not allowed to be a female or a minority.
And it's so bizarre. And I know, we've said this, but it's like this idea. It's like Star Wars fans who don't understand that all the things they say, I mean, they're the fucking Empire.
Yeah.
They sound like the bad guys and they don't understand it. This fascist mindset is clearly bad. It's exactly what, Lucas is saying. This is the bad guys. It's the ominous music, right?
But they've got this Dunning-Kruger where they can't even identify the fact that it's indicative of their behavior, or their behavior is indicative of the attributes that are the villainy. It's frustrating, but if you're going to act like that, you're probably short-sighted on several facets.
Right. And here's the thing. I come right back around this thing, and this is such a struggle because, ratings matter and I have people that I know going like, oh, Marvel's dead. The box office isn't going to be what it was. But no one's saying that the movies are still making money. And no, they're, it seems like, at around Endgame, actually after Infinity War, when Captain Marvel made $1 billion because people were so in the frenzy. Because by the way, you and I both thought Captain Marvel is not great. I love that character, and the
I love that
movie just
character.
wasn't put together that well, you
Yeah,
know, and it frustrates me.
I mean, ultimately, the Eternals is the perfect
Worse,
example
yes,
of
but
it just didn't
but
the bread didn't rise. I think we
right.
say
But my
with some of
point is
these.
that, but Captain Marvel still made $1 billion,
Heck
you
yeah,
know, which
they're
is
all gonna
crazy.
make $1 billion.
Well,
Ian Rainey says he thought maybe the warning was because armed damage control agents enter a mosque, which is also something that there was a lot of stuff going on in that episode 6.
yeah, no, I think it was definitely the high
The
school
high school.
armed guards going into high school.
Well, especially after episode 1
Yeah.
of Obi-Wan
But
and their
yeah.
opening. Yeah.
By the way, I mean, here's the thing: is I love that the show constantly kept saying all this stuff of like, you know, you're going to hide in a mosque. I mean, we're completely surveilled. All that, like, it made all these big political statements.
Yeah.
You know,
Well, her friend
and they're not
Nakia,
debatable.
Her friend Nakia, who is the political, she was becoming a political
Yeah.
organizer and running for office, like,
And
was awesome.
calling out the conditions in the mosques about how women are treated. I mean, I was like, wow. I was really like, wow, they're really going for it in this show. It was great.
So,
you know, and is it for everyone? It's not for everyone. That's okay. It doesn't have to be.
Do we want to blow the doors open on episode 6 and just talk about the elephants in the room?
So basically, you know, they hadn't done the Inhuman thing. They did this thing with the bangle and her being descended. So she's partly Jinn because of the clandestine.
But other people are handling the bangle in the series, and nothing.
Yeah, and Bruno's super smart, which is also out of the comics, and he analyzed her genetic makeup, and he threw in a word. You know, he said, you know, there's something about your genetic makeup, and you're a mutation. And
he said there is a mutation. It can still be Inhuman. But
it's not.
A certain music stinger said something else.
Yeah, the music stinger, as well as the fact that, and very specifically, Marvel's been saying, you know, they're calling out the mutants are coming, and Feige said it's going to come. You're not going to know where to expect it, you know,
because it's coming in multiple tiers. Like we saw an alternate dimension Professor X, and now we have. How does the music go, Ian? When he says there's a mutation, what did we hear? Why don't you hum it out for us right now? It was like electric guitar. It was like
yeah.
And I actually rewound it because I think Heidi had asked a question during it, and I went, I did the Leonardo DiCaprio pointing at the screen thing, and I was like, hold up, this is important. It's important to us. And
my wife, like, she heard me go, I gasped.
Yeah. You know? As Nerd World Order says, our good buddy Alan, if you want to go listen to another podcast, check it out on their YouTube channel. Nerd World Order is pretty awesome. And he says, yes, the music was perfect. And we heard that music when Professor X rolled out in Doctor Strange 2. And I was like, okay, so they're going to not do the Inhuman thing. And I thought the window was open for an Inhuman thing because we all loved Black Bolt and Doctor Strange 2. And I want to see the Inhumans. I love Black Bolt. I love those characters. I really want Lockjaw.
And maybe they will go ahead and redeem that, but they don't need to do that now. You know, I mean, they need to get the X-Men off. You know,
but here we go. We're starting to see some mutants, and Kamala's probably one of them, like she was originally intended. The comments are blowing up because Jim Pellegrino says, also, this show's political slant makes me hopeful for how MCU will handle the mutants. Mutants are all about civil rights. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I knew Singer would be right when you opened up that first X-Men movie and you see Magneto in Auschwitz. I thought that was like, okay, they're going to get it right. Yeah. Hopefully they keep that up here.
Well, yeah, and that's just it. Yeah. I mean, you know, in that first X-Men movie, you get that whole thing about people being afraid. These people are popping up, and does it make them a second-class citizens and how people react to it? And, you know, you're already seeing that with Damage Control about how they're treating powered individuals, right?
Well, Christopher Yeeman over on YouTube, old school Geekscape, I said, love you, man. He says, all of Phase 4 is basically X-Men edging. I think now that we have the Negative Zone and mutants in Ms. Marvel, it's fantastic. It's all the Fox properties edging is what's going on over here. I think the damage control stuff that just reminded me of the couple of years ago, and it's kind of been going on now. Is they had the storyline where young superpowered individuals were outlawed.
Oh,
you had the government going after the champions.
It actually just. I mean, it barely ended this year.
That's right.
It's very recent. And it was all based on, oddly enough, Kamala Khan gets injured in her civilian identity and was actually in a coma briefly. And so they did it all in her name.
Yeah, so Geekscape I thought the damage control angle was going to be that. It was the most recent comics. It's been going on for 2-3 years. Is younger. It's almost like Civil War where they had to register, but it was really underage heroes were forced to
but
register.
it was a retread of the registration thing,
right? But it was specifically for the champions and the characters like Miles Morales and Kamala Khan and Young Hawkeye, etc. Okay, so we got mutants, and we're gonna start probably seeing more mutants. I don't think we're gonna see them in She-Hulk, but I did hear that in She-Hulk we're gonna get Jessica Jones.
Yep, and we know we're getting Daredevil in that.
And we know we're getting Matt Murdock because it's a courtroom.
Yeah.
We'll have Emil Blonsky, but let's talk about the mid-credit, whatever it was. That's confirmed the negative zone in the Negabands.
So here's the thing. So, of course, it's interesting that the entire thing, she's so obsessed with Carol Danvers. And then out of nowhere, the Bangle seems to react and poof, she switches places seemingly. She disappears and Carol Danvers is in her place.
Did you like that her father gives her the name Miss Marvel? And also, Ian,
I did. I thought it was very touching.
It was beautiful. And
I didn't know that Kamala meant that.
Did you pop when they opened the package from Grandma and it was the suit from the comics that they've been building to throughout the series? With
I actually really reacted when her necklace in episode 5 had turned into the symbol, and so
that was cool.
Inspired the mother. I was like, okay, that's what they're doing.
But when I saw the costume, and then they hid the costume from you in a couple of action sequences, you just see her feet. You just see her kind of running around. She stops at the red light, and then she keeps going. And I'm like, let's see the whole costume, because Heidi had never seen it, and I was like, just wait. She sees it. It's awesome. And then,
unfortunately,
you also got excited.
But you only have it on the screen before you even start the show. It's her sitting on the lamppost,
But the other part that was cool was the end fight. Really, the end. It's not really a fight, but it's a way to protect Cameron from himself, who has now developed these powers that kind of out of control. When she says "embiggen," and now the Negaband power, the Bangle power, is really representative of her ability.
And that's what the showrunner said, that don't worry, we're going to get there, because that's the thing, is
the embiggen stuff.
She basically does all the things. In the comics, her abilities are stretching. She was a little beyond Reed Richards, sort of, but more very similar. And I think that's why, a big part of why they stepped away from that. And I don't know, I think that they probably wanted to be an energy manipulator because of how that lines up with the other Marvels, with Captain Marvel, and I'm assuming Monica's going to be called Photon.
Sure.
So that remains to be seen. But that's where she finally, the giant fist. I mean, it started off initially with that save with the giant hand, but actually growing her body and all that is very representative of really what she does.
And I gotta say, the fight with Cameron, her fighting her way past Cameron's powers, people are like, oh my god, when the community comes out and helps her and stands between her and damage control, it's like Spider-Man 2. They all, for me, I was like, oh, but the fight to Cameron was very X3.
Yeah,
where it was like, I have to stop him, and it was like Wolverine fighting to Jean Grey. And let's not bring up X3 anymore. Sorry about that. That should have so been Logan and Scott fighting to Jean Grey, but obviously Scott wasn't in the movie at that point. But I think that would have been a beautiful ending to the first 3 X-Men movies. But politics of studios are going to be politics of studios. And so let's talk about that mid-credit scene. She it's not a striking of the band, it's not a striking of the Bangle, but she gets sucked into her closet. She disappears, but out of the closet, Carol Danvers pops up for a cameo. There's a negative zone switcheroo going on, much like Rick Jones.
Definitely seems like it. We'll see. And I guess the Marvels doesn't come out to, what is it, March or something of 2023?
It's either our February or March movie. We got Wakanda Forever in November, and then I think we have the Marvels coming.
Right.
Are you going to look that up, or
I'm looking to me? But
because there's a lot of places, like you said, there's a lot of stuff that's got where we can go from this.
Not until July 28th, 2023.
I quit. I don't want to wait.
A whole year.
A year?
Can I just say that's some fucking bullshit?
Ian, next week, are we going to get a Fantastic Four cast announcement, or is it mainly going to be Marvel comics, and they're going to save that stuff for D23?
I think we're getting that. I mean, I hope so. There has to be something big there, and I think that makes sense. Look, Krasinski, I think he keeps doing it. He stays, he's Mr. Fantastic. There's some rumors out there that Dakota Fanning got hired, and people think that she may be, Sue Storm, Sue Richards.
Okay.
I think that works.
That's the first time I've heard that. Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, the age that. Yeah, supposedly she signed a deal with Marvel.
Because in the comics they had an age difference as well. Reed and Sue.
Yeah.
It also allows you to cast a younger Johnny Storm.
And by the way,
that you can keep on a contract.
And Dakota Fanning and John Krasinski, their age difference is, I think it's like 13, 15 years, something like that, Sure. But I mean, yeah, because in the comics, they never actually say, but, it was back in those creepy times where, Reed and Ben seem like they're in their 40s and Sue's
he's like her
19,
TA or something, but like, he's like a grad student and she's an undergrad.
It seems like it's 20.
He's got a PhD
they seem like it's
and she's in high school.
Now, it doesn't quite seem like that now. Because now it seems like she's probably in her late 30s, early 40s, and he's like, late 40s. But back then it was like, she seemed like a girl, right. Like she's, because Johnny's only like, 15, 16. So, I think this, but back in the day it was Johnny Storm with the Human Torch, Bobby Drake, who was Iceman, and Peter Parker were all the same age.
Yeah.
And that means they start out at 15.
But if you cast Dakota Fanning,
16 quickly
it allows her to have a younger brother, Johnny Storm, who could be, be comparable.
He's still an adult.
Yeah, but you can also cast an older Ben if he's comparable to Reed's age. Okay, so Ian, we're gonna see them again in the Marvels. We've got a negative zone now, I think, so we're gonna see some more Fantastic Four popping up. We've got ourselves a mutant.
Yeah.
In the 616 MCU.
Now, and they told us Fantastic Four is the last movie in Phase 4. It's this phase. We don't know how long the phase is supposed to last,
dude. Until they got to get a director first.
Yeah, I mean,
You think Krasinski's just going to do it?
They got him. I mean, can it be a one-off? It can be, but it feels like it's too iconic casting for that to have just been the one-off.
Mm-hmm.
But they haven't said officially.
Okay. All right, Ian. Any other pieces to tie up? Because we're going to be talking very soon about some She-Hulk. We're obviously going to see each other in a few days in San Diego. We got so much going on there. You're going to cameo on the show. We'll get a couple of interviews. I'm not leaving that booth too much. I've got a panel, but other than that, I'm not leaving too much. So you're going to be our eyes on the street. You'll come by the booth and we'll record quick 5-10 minute.
Cool.
What have you seen, Ian's? I'm looking forward to it, but dang, I'm putting stuff together I'm putting the booth schedule together right now, and I'm putting together just everything we're doing in San Diego. And I'm a little overwhelmed, Geekscapists, but definitely wanted to make sure that we were timely on this Miss Marvel special for all of you. What else? You got anything else to add, Ian? Anything cool?
I think that's it. I think overall, I guess I feel like I've probably beat this a bit, but this point, but it's a good show. It's a solid show. I generally feel that way about the Marvel shows, as much as the movies have been a little disappointing, lately. But the shows, they all have their own voice. They're about character development. They're not just about, hey, let's just do a giant VFX extravaganza. Mind you, they still have some of that, but they're not, if I'm let down at all in Ms. Marvel, it's that going into it, there was never a really big bad thing, but arguably that makes it refreshing. It's not what it's about.
This had the most character in personality of any of them, but character-based personality, not style-based, not plot-based, character-focused, character-based personality. Here's an idea for you, Ian.
Hawkeye has a lot of that too.
You're right. We're gonna have a Stump the Ian contest at the booth. That's Big Ganks' proposal there. If you can stump Ian, maybe you get a T-shirt or something like that. What do you think?
Sure.
You got nothing.
It's not costing me anything.
All right, Geekscapists. You're going to be hearing from us next week. Please subscribe to the podcast. Tell your friends about the podcast. Tell your friends about the podcast network. We're still adding shows. So really any interest that you've got, whether it's these deep dives into comic books and films, or if it's something regarding movies or music or comedy or wrestling, we got podcasts to scratch your itch. So search for Geekscape and be a part of it. Search for us on the socials. Definitely be subscribing to the Geekscape Instagrams. Also be on the Facebooks and the Twitters, because that's where we're going to be talking about what we're doing at the booth. and all the guests we're going to have next week at Comic-Con and everything going on. So be part of that discussion. The Geekscape Forever group on Facebook is a great place to discuss a lot of this stuff and what's going on at Comic-Con. There's going to be tons of announcements, obviously. And share this with your friends. Leave us a 5-star review. And thank you for listening. And thank you for watching. All right. We'll see y'all next week in a few days. Peace.
Bye.